Jared Taylor is a well-known white advocate and popular figure on the alternative right-wing movement. In this video, we will seek to understand how Jared Taylor's interactions with his detractors touch on Slavoj Žižek's understanding of ideology and his understanding of the Big Other. The Big Other is the gaze of the law, which emerges through interactions between subjects. One must also understand what the existence of the Big Other entails. That is, the Big Other presupposes the notion of the symbolic order, which is the sphere of the law. It is a condition of all communication, as one must always abide by the symbolic rules and norms in order to enter into any social relation. In this context, the symbolic order are the laws regarding the taboo around discussing the reality of race and IQ, in-group preference, and what should be done about these things. The Big Other, on the other hand, is the virtual gaze of the symbolic order, which registers any activity which quote-unquote it becomes aware of. Jared Taylor is someone who publicly rejects the unjust rules regarding speaking about race in contemporary society, and he does so by means of telling the quote-unquote Big Other, which everyone knows deep down. Now this may sound extremely abstract, and it is, so in order to clarify these concepts precisely, I shall now pass off the video to my friend Trey from the channel Bound, who will further elaborate on the concepts mentioned previously and how they relate to the philosophy of Slavoj Žižek.
Thank you, Gabe. Well, firstly, let's begin by introducing Žižek's understanding of ideology and the Big Other, which are two intimately related concepts. In 1989, Žižek published his breakout text, The Sublime Object of Ideology, wherein he famously reinterpreted Marx's concept of ideology. As he puts it, quote, "If we want to grasp the dimension of fantasy, we must return to the Marxian formula, they do not know it, but they are doing it, and pose ourselves a very simple question. Where is the place of ideological illusion? In the knowing or in the doing in the reality itself?" Unquote. To answer the question, for Žižek, ideology, at least as it exists in the current age, exists in the very form of our activity. This is contrasted with the popular reading of Marx, in which ideology is the false consciousness which mystifies the truth of a social relation. In Capital, Marx gives a concise formulation of this idea. Quote, "In order to relate their products to one another as commodities, men are compelled to equate their various labors to abstract human labor. They do not know it, but they do it, by reducing the material thing to the abstraction, value. This is the primordial and hence unconsciously instinctive operation of their brain, which necessarily grows out of the particular manner of their material production and the relationships into which this production sets them." Unquote. Here Marx is identifying a misrecognition on the part of the subject, its failure to recognize the material basis of a commodity's value, abstracting a non-existent substantial value out of the material thing. Commodity fetishism is this form of misrecognition, the misidentification of a commodity's value with its thingness, as opposed to the function it serves within a social relation and the labor put into it. For Žižek, however, ideological illusion doesn't reside in this misrecognition. He'd even argue that the average person today is aware that a commodity has no essential value outside of its place within the social relations which constitute the market. Rather, he would argue that the ideological illusion exists in the fact that we act as though a commodity has real value in itself, despite knowing otherwise. Here's a short clip of Žižek explaining this.
Commodity is in reality just an ordinary object who functions as money, commodity, because of social relations. And this is what we think also. So what we think is close to reality, if you want. But the side of commodity fetishism is not our beliefs, it's our social reality itself. We act as if we embody our belief in our social exchange.
Now let's use a more concrete example from recent history of ideology embodied in our activity, the cultural reaction to the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking scandal. While everyone knows that Epstein and a large number of high-profile individuals were involved in these heinous activities, and of course that Epstein didn't kill himself, we nevertheless accept them as our leaders. Even though there was a seemingly large cultural reaction to the scandal, there were very little, if any, institutional changes. This is the basis of Žižek's critique of large social demonstrations which offer no permanent solution. As he puts it, he would sell his mother into slavery in order to see the movie V for Vendetta 2, as the first one simply ends with the crowd taking over the Parliament building. Žižek cares more about the day after, the permanent institutional changes that are made as a result of temporary social uprisings. In the case of Epstein, Žižek's critique is very applicable. While the cultural reaction to the scandal may have been large, by not forcing any institutional changes, there ultimately was no consequences for those in power. We essentially accepted the legitimacy of our corrupt rulers in our very actions, despite publicly denouncing them as pedophiles. Now let me propose an alternative situation, one in which the criminal elites publicly confessed their guilt. How would society react in that situation? I believe that there would in fact be some form of institutional change, because we would be forced to confront this situation directly. However, in some sense, this isn't adequate as an explanation, as society has directly confronted the issue. Almost everyone knows and will publicly talk about how Epstein didn't kill himself and how many high-status individuals are almost certainly criminals. So what exactly would change in the situation wherein the elites pull off their masks and tell the world what everyone already knows? This is where Žižek's understanding of the Lacanian notion of the big other becomes relevant. Here I won't be able to give a very detailed account of the concept, or that of the symbolic order, and if you're unfamiliar with these concepts, I highly suggest you watch my recent video on the topic. Link is in the description. So essentially, the big other is the virtual gaze of the law / the symbolic order, which emerges as a result of the activity of individual people. The symbolic order, being the sphere of laws, prohibitions, and social norms, is not just an abstraction, akin to a constitution. Rather, it has its own method of enforcing itself through the big other. Now I realize that this is fairly abstract, and I would usually provide a bunch of examples of the big other in action, but for the sake of time I'll rely solely on the Epstein example. So how does the concept of the big other become useful in explaining the hypothetical situation I just previously mentioned? Well, it should be noted that if the elites were to publicly admit their guilt, no one would actually learn any new information. The public already knows that many high-status individuals were implicated in the Epstein scandal, and obviously these people know that they were, so who exactly has learned anything new here? The answer is the big other, and more precisely, the big other which exists as the product of the relationship between the public and the official or institutional narrative. We can conceptualize this as someone telling law enforcement about a certain crime, as the big other is the gaze of the law. So in this situation, law enforcement has essentially been told directly that the elites are criminals. This means that there can no longer be any sort of distance made between the public and the elites. The former can no longer act as if they're doing their social duty of opposing those in power by publicly revealing their knowledge of their transgression, as there would no longer be any opposition between themselves and the official narrative. All that remains is the simple fact that the elites in power engage in heinous criminal activity. Once again, I realize that this is fairly abstract, which is why I suggest watching my video on the topic, which explains this all in detail. But to briefly conclude, ideology is understood by Žižek as existing within our very actions. It is not merely a misrecognition of the truth of a situation, but knowing this truth and nevertheless acting contrary to its implications. The symbolic order, on the other hand, is the sphere of laws and rules and regulations which exist in any social relation. And the big other is the virtual gaze of the law, which publicly registers those who transgress it. Now that I've briefly gone over Slavoj Žižek's understanding of ideology and the big other, Gabriel will now show a clip of Jared Taylor and then explain how his views on race share many conceptual similarities with Žižek's social theory.
This concept of implicit whiteness, it's by no means sufficient. Yes,
Right.
White people live in certain neighborhoods. They go to classical music concerts. They go to farmers markets. They do things that are overwhelmingly white. But unless they do this explicitly, unless they're prepared to say, yes, this is our society and it must bear our stamp, they're doing nothing. They're running away. And whenever you ask white people, well, can you name a majority non-white neighborhood you'd like to live in? Most of them just come up stumped. So there is a preposterous hypocrisy in how whites behave as opposed to what they profess to believe. Yes, race is clearly important to them, but until they're prepared to say, yes, it is important to me and I'm prepared to do something about it, then all this implicit whiteness, as far as I'm concerned, scarcely matters.
Here we see Taylor unknowingly touch on two important concepts in Žižek's philosophical edifice, that is, ideology and the big other. The quote-unquote hypocrisy, which Taylor and many critical race theorists rightly point out, is that the outward expressions of tolerance and love of diversity by many whites is proven to be false by their very own actions. This can be empirically verified For example, there is the phenomena of quote-unquote white flight, which according to Wikipedia is defined as the sudden or gradual large-scale migration of white people from areas becoming more racially and ethnoculturally diverse. This phenomena has been proved statistically, and I quote, "In 2018, research at Indiana University showed that between 2000 and 2010 in the U.S., a sample size of 27,891 census tracts, 3,252 experienced quote-unquote white flight. The examined areas had an average magnitude loss of 40% of the original white population. The study found relative to poorer neighborhoods, white flight becomes systematically more likely in middle-class neighborhoods at higher thresholds of Black, Hispanic, and Asian population presence." As mentioned previously, both the critical race theorists and Taylor see the contradiction between the rhetoric and the behavior of most whites as shown in the phenomena of white flight. Of course, there is a difference between Taylor and the critical race theorists, as he sees white flight as an expression of a fundamental biological truth, while they would attribute it to political, social, and cultural factors. This distinction is ultimately irrelevant to the topic at hand. All we wish to say is that Žižek's definition of ideology as, quote, "they know very well how things really are, but they are still doing it as if they did not know," unquote, applies to this situation perfectly. Furthermore, Taylor's entire mission is to get whites to openly affirm our identity, or to tell the big other what he believes most whites already believe privately. This is why he'll often speak about how we only speak about race honestly in hushed voices at the dinner table, while refusing to acknowledge our beliefs publicly. He sees this as an imminent threat to the survival of the white race. This video is not about whether Taylor or Žižek or anyone else is correct, but simply to point out the differences and the surprising similarities between the two. Another one of these similarities is that they both see an ideological or even pathological dimension in what Žižek calls white liberal rhetoric. Wherein white liberals denounce themselves as the sole oppressors and evildoers of history, both Žižek and Taylor agree that this rhetoric hides a certain egotistic pleasure and is not motivated by purely altruistic intentions. The following is a clip from one of Žižek's lectures where he critiques what he calls quote-unquote white liberal racism.
But I noticed something else, how beneath, I'm now talking about these typical multiculturalist leftist liberals, beneath this self-humiliating gesture, oh, we are guilty for everything, imperialist colonizers, we don't have the right, renouncing all your particular features always comes with, in a discreet way, asserting your position of universality. All this apparently modest, self-denigrating white people, at the same time, I noticed, have no problems behaving in a very patronizing way towards others, correcting them, telling them when they...
In this clip, we see Žižek touch on something Taylor has also recognized, which is that the white liberal renunciation of themselves produces a certain pleasure. However, they are not in full agreement here. For Žižek, the antagonism, or to use the Lacanian term, the quote-unquote real of the situation is that white racism persists in the white liberals through the elevation of their quote-unquote whiteness to the position of universality. They become the figures who promote the existence and activities of particular ethnic identities while keeping a certain distance from them. For Taylor, on the other hand, the quote-unquote real has to do with the inherent antagonism between the races, speaking in general terms, coupled with what he calls white self-hatred. Taylor doesn't see any reaffirmation of quote-unquote whiteness in any positive sense. Through the renunciation of their legitimacy and their constant self-degradation, he sees the notion of whiteness as a legitimate category simply being replaced with one that has evil connotations. While whites may feel a sense of moral superiority, which Jared admits, that is not another way of them asserting their identity as white in an attempt to maintain the historic reality of white supremacy. Thus, the source of their pleasure is the feeling of moral superiority they have in rejecting their identity. But unlike Žižek, he wouldn't see it as a backhanded way of embracing their whiteness. Thus we conclude. Today we discuss ideology and the big other, and how they relate to Jared Taylor and his thoughts. It must also be stated that the concepts borrowed to produce this video often flourish within a left-wing atmosphere, and considering this and how it applies to right-wing movements, I must ask those of a left-wing disposition who have a concrete understanding of the big other and the social laws implicit in our discourse, why not open up to these discussions in this context? Why is what Jared calls an honest conversation about race completely out of the picture? This is especially relevant for a group that prides itself on breaking social taboos. I must ask them, why is this one exempt?